I had rather hoped that some of you would turn up in a state of undress after last night's party, but I recognise Melbourne weather made that unlikely. Let me welcome you here and let me explain this is a discussion rather than a series of presentations. It's a discussion with four people who have thought over a long period of time about the issues we're raising. And my role is basically to ask some provocative questions, and there will be time for people in the audience to join in after we've had a bit of a discussion on stage. My name is Dennis Altman, and as I'm going to ask each of the panellists to tell us three things that we should all know about ourselves for the purpose of this discussion, I guess the three things I would say is, firstly, I'm primarily a writer, and as a writer, I really wish people in the AIDS world would read more books and fewer UN reports. Secondly, I have had a history, and Malu and I were talking about this going back to the early days of community networking, particularly in Asia and the Pacific. And thirdly, I am currently, and for a long time, live in Melbourne, so it's particularly exciting for me to be on a panel with four people who have come to the conference. I want to just open the discussion by saying that the official title of this panel, which was of course decided not by us but by the conference planners, is the intersection of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender rights and HIV and AIDS. And what I want to do is ask the panel essentially to problematize both the use of the term LGBT, and I'm going to now say straight away we should be saying LGBTI. In many places we would be saying LGBTIQAA or whatever. I want us to problematize that term. I also want us to question seriously the way in which it seems to be taken for granted in this conference that there is an inevitable and essential link between the discourses of human rights and the discourses of sexual rights. And for us to think about that and to think about it analytically and whether that is in fact the best and only framing. And I just want to put it in context by saying that in some ways there is currently going on at a global level a Cold War around the recognition of what I would prefer to call, and I'm going to ask the panellists to comment on this, sexual orientation and gender identity, which is currently referred to as SOGI. But there is, in a sense, a new Cold War in which, ironically, both Presidents Obama and President Putin are taking very different positions. And when I say ironically, of course, in the traditional or previous Cold War, the US, one of the few things the United States and the Soviet Union could agree on was that any form of divergence from, quote, the norm in sexuality or gender identity was a bad thing, corrupting, and probably the result of machinations by the other side. And so I do want to frame the discussion in terms of a large political debate now going on globally that is, of course, directly related to how we manage and how we respond to the HIV epidemic. So with that, I'm going to go back to my chair. I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, as I say, with three things that they would like you to know about them, and then we'll move into the discussion. So maybe, Peter, if I just start with you and go across to Malu.
Thank you very much indeed, Dennis, for that introduction. I should say that the panel is sort of structurally disadvantaged by the lights in our eyes. So if at any point in the course of our discussion we become slightly incoherent or dazed, it's actually because we can't see anything at all. I assume you can see us quite dramatically from wherever you are sitting. My name's Peter Aggleton. I'm a social scientist. I work at the Centre for Social Research in Health, which used to be called the National Centre in HIV Social Research at UNSW, Australia, which used to be called the University of New South Wales. It's in Sydney. I edit a couple of journals. One of them is called Culture, Health and Sexuality, which enables me to read many, many papers from all over the world. And another which is called Sex Education, which enables me to read papers engaging with the continuing wars there are globally about should sex education be provided to young people in schools and so on and so forth. I became gay in the year 1985. I hadn't been gay beforehand, but a transformation occurred to me in the context of HIV. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I was commenting that the light here is like the opposite thing of a dark room. It's a kind of shiny room, but the effect is the same, like we can't see anything. My name is Mauro Cabral. I am from Argentina, actually not from Buenos Aires, from another city called Córdoba. I don't play football and I couldn't care less about it. Not about Pelé, Maradona or Messi. And I don't dance tango, so if that were your entry points, that won't work with me. I'm also part of the Latin American Consortium on intersex issues. And I hope this to be a discussion, a very interesting discussions about how LGBTI issues are playing in the HIV world.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Othman Melouk. I am from Morocco. I am co-chair of the Global Forum on MSM and HIV, and I do also treatment activists. I think my case and my background is the best illustration for this topic we are going to discuss today, because in the mid-90s, when I started working on HIV field, in fact, at that time, I haven't known or seen any person living with HIV. I am HIV negative, so I was not really directly concerned. But in the Moroccan context, it was the entry point for me to do something for my community. So I came to the HIV field to do LGBT activism. And I'm still here 20 years later.
Oh no, the 20-plus-year-old activists are here. My name is Malu Marin, and I'm from the Philippines. I started working on LGBT issues way back in the 90s. I was part of one of the first lesbian organizations in the Philippines called the Lesbian Collective that was formed in 1992. I was co-founder of Asia Pacific Rainbow, which was the regional network of LGBTs in Asia Pacific. I remember a time when MSM was not a buzzword, and in AIDS conferences, we would be at hotel lobbies having meetings and not having proper meeting rooms. And now, look at how we've gone. So at that time, we were still meeting and coming together as an LGBT community and not separately as MSM or trans or etc. I got involved full-time in HIV work in the year 2000, focusing on issues of migration and HIV. And right now I'm a regional network, regional coordinator of Seven Sisters, which is a coalition of Asia-Pacific community regional networks on HIV/AIDS.
I'm going to pick up on both what I said at the beginning and the way in which people have introduced themselves, and start by suggesting that every time we use these acronyms, and let us agree that the title of this topic really should have included I. So every time we talk about LGBTI, it seems to me essential to actually spell it out. And I want to put to each of you, I may well start with you, Mauro, because you're scrambling in your bag for something. I just want us to all think about the difference between talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, which in a sense implies fixed identities and therefore minorities, as against using an expression like, and I know not everyone on this panel is comfortable with that expression, sexual orientation and gender identity, which can, of course, apply to everybody, and which recognises the possibility of change and fluidity. And it's not my place to, although I do, to necessarily take a position on that, but I really want, when we have this discussion, people, rather than just using the initials as if it was a noun, to actually think through who are we talking about and what are we talking about. And so, Mara, I think I'll start with you and then let everybody else make comments.
What a bright idea you have. I don't like very much the acronym LGTBI, and not because of the identity things. I think that it can be used for identity purpose and it can be used for different purpose, like political representation or funding. But being a trans and intersex activist, basically when people say LGTB or LGTBI, I know that it's, there's a high probability that trans people are not going to be included, and the I is going to be present and absent, taking turns. So, with some colleagues, friends, allies, both in the trans and intersex movement, we consider, and I consider that personally, that only gay men are LGTBI. And only gay organizations are LGTBI organizations. So when someone says I am a lesbian, the person is usually a lesbian, or someone says I am a transgender person or an intersex person, it's usually the case. And when someone goes to an international conference and says I am a LGTBI person, I'm sure that it's a gay man. And so in that sense, the LGTBI seems to be very oppressive in that sense. But on the other hand, the problem with sexual orientation and gender identity, it seems that all experience in the world needs to match in this kind of Cartesian axis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And what about gender expression? And what about body diversity? I don't know if we can replace one thing or the other. For doing trans and intersex activism, SOGI is not enough. And to be sincere, most of the time, SOGI is basically so, because gender identity issues tend to occupy a very, very limited place, or a secondary place, when it comes to be about sexual orientation and gender identity. And if you go through different UN reports, for example, on SOGI issues, you will find that the weight that sexual orientation is having in regard to gender identity, well, it's really different.
Malu, do you want to? I'm going to ask all of you to comment, so maybe we just start, Malu, with you and then hear from Ottman and Peter.
When I started, doing work or, being involved in activism in this field, LGBT was not actually, in fact, at the time being used. And we were just really comfortable in our own space as lesbians, situated within the feminist movement. And we had also to struggle within, even, in the feminist movement, to assert our own identities and to become, in a sense, independent, and to also battle lesbophobia within. So it was a struggle. And I think coming together and working tactically or strategically with all the other people in the alphabet soup of LGBT rights work, in a sense was, coming from a realization that there was a broader goal or agenda that we had to pursue and that we had to do it together collectively. So that became, some sort of a rallying point for us to have that more cohesive identity together as marginalized groups. I don't know if you remember the term sexual minority, because that was also used at that time. And in fact, the evolution of these terms, I think, is something that, characterizes also the kind of waves that we've gone through in this work. And I think it's a continuing evolution of sorts. We keep evolving. And so the point about SOGI as a more encompassing sort of frame, I think, is really for political expediency, because if you're talking to the UN and all these other intergovernmental platforms, and it's not palatable for them to hear lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and then but if you put it in a frame where it's sexual orientation, gender identity, it's sort of it masks the harshness of it, and I think in some ways it's useful to use the term, and now it's really becoming more sort of mainstream, but it shouldn't make us lose sight of what we really want and the kind of goals we want to pursue in terms of the whole issue of sexual rights and the fight that we need to wage in this whole political battle.
Well, personally, I think it's important sometimes to name things by their names, and I'm speaking maybe more from the context of my region, where, and I will speak for gay men to start, where there is a denial of the existence of gay men in our region, and when there isn't this denial or there is a recognition, so gay men should be fought, gay men are criminalized, etc. In such context, I think there is a large part of the community who wants to name things. And putting people in acronyms or even in SOGI, although I like this concept, it is important for people to be named and to say some words. It is the same for the trans, because they are not visible when you speak about LGBTI people. It's especially in the context of an international conference, it's almost gay men. Bisexual do not even exist. I haven't met a person in this conference who said, I'm bisexual, and very often bisexual, either men or women, are seen as gay or lesbian people who are in the closet, and then they have, they don't want to say they are gay, but they're having sex with men and they're having sex with women, etc. So I think in each separate movement, it is important to name the categories, and because it's one part of the affirmation and the fact to say we exist as gay men or as lesbians or trans, etc. But yes, when it comes to, I think personally I use the different wording strategically, and in a context, for example, of my region, it's easier to initiate discussions if you speak from a SOGI perspective. If you say we're going to talk about LGBTI rights in Morocco, either with the government or with the authorities or with, it's a red flag and it doesn't work. So I think there is also the strategic use for funding, for advocacy, for that makes us also use this or this concept.
I'm going to insert one comment before I pass to Peter, which is because Othman, I think, really importantly raised the question of where the bees fit. And I am sufficiently an old-fashioned Freudian to believe that human beings are potentially all bisexual. And I therefore find the concept of a bisexual identity particularly puzzling. Having said that, and the bisexual identified people can come and bash me up afterwards, I hope in a pleasant, consensual S&M form, I'll pass over to Peter.
Well, I've always had an allergy to essentialisms of various kinds. And this notion that somehow there is a truth or an essence that is to be discovered. Having said that, I also recognize the appeal of essentialisms. I can remember before I came out as being gay in 1985, I was in many ways, I suppose, in retrospect, confused, although what I was searching for was an essentialism that would describe myself. The trouble was the available categories weren't very appealing. I mean, first of all, the word homosexual at that time tended to connote people, if I think of people in UK films like Kenneth Williams and Charles Hawtrey and our famous comedians, Larry Grayson and so on, who were not the kind of person I knew I was, and who all seemed to lead rather sad lives. And in retrospect, as their biographies and autobiographies in some cases have been written, they clearly did lead very, very difficult and sad lives, mainly, of course, due to the circumstances, the social conditions surrounding them. So for me, this is a tricky issue because throughout this epidemic in particular, we've constructed a variety of categories by which to understand ourselves and others. MSM, of course, is probably the most influential of those categories. I mean, to the point at which it's now become part of accepted discourse that almost anybody can use the word without causing a degree of offense. And SOGI, S-O-G-I, I suppose, is another term. But what we tend to do often is we forget that these constructions were indeed constructed for particular purposes at particular moments in time, and they are ultimately approximations to any situation. I don't, in my view, they're not truths. They are the best we can do using the resources for thought that are available at any one moment in time. So, where does that lead us? I'm not quite sure. I'll pass back to Dennis, I think.
Okay. I want to go back to now the connection between this discussion and the discussions around the epidemic broadly. And clearly the discussions around the epidemic have been very much framed by the early work that Jonathan Mann, I guess, epitomizes of linking health and human rights. And I think that you could have spent the entire week going from session to session being told that we need respect human rights, and somehow if we do respect human rights and we make the connection, we have solved things. I actually want to pose, and I'm being deliberately difficult because I want to provoke some discussion, I want to suggest that the human rights framework is not always the most useful way of talking about whatever we're going to call it. And I'm saying whatever we're going to call it because I want the panel to think about situations where it may actually be more useful, rather than talking about rights, which in many parts of the world sound like individualistic, liberal Western rhetoric, to talking about, for example, acknowledgement of diversity, acknowledgement of equality, acknowledgement of the importance in development of bringing everybody along. And I'm sure people on the panel will have other terms they may want to use, but the essential question is, what are the strengths and what are the problems of framing our responses to the epidemic consistently as one of increasing and using a human rights language? And maybe Othman, I should perhaps start with you.
Well, I think that we speak a lot about human rights, but we don't invest enough in human rights. And actually, I think 1% of less than 1% of the spending on HIV response globally is dedicated to human rights. I think the big mistake, we all agree that there is something that needs to be done, and we've seen in this conference that we have all the tools if we want to stop this epidemic to do it. But there is a big problem. We're all aware about the problem, but we're not investing in the good solution. I think the big mistake that we're doing is that we're expecting the HIV movement and when it comes to, I'm going to speak from the MSM perspective, to do all the human rights work that is needed. And I think it is a big mistake because the HIV, we're reducing this issue of human rights to a disease only. And I think we need to have an independent movement for, I won't say for the rights of LGBTI, I will say a movement, because it's not only about human rights issue. We cannot either reduce the LGBTI movements only to human rights issues. There is culture, there's other things that we need. And I think until now, and especially in developing countries and especially in my continent, Africa, or my region, Middle East and North Africa, if we don't invest parallelly in the HIV work, and even when it's an issue of sexual minorities, and we're investing in sexual minorities groups who are doing HIV work, we need to have a parallel movement and to invest in this movement. I think this movement should also benefit from the funding that is available, should benefit from be part of the national discussions that are happening with countries who have the chance to have the Global Fund, which fortunately the Global Fund is pushing our countries to have these discussions. So I think we're not investing enough in, and I won't say only human rights, in LGBTI movements that are really needed to address this epidemic. We don't invest enough in the connections between the two movements, and reduction of the LGBTI activism to human rights only is not enough.
Maybe Peter?
Yes, I mean, I need to speak, of course, as a social scientist and not as a lawyer or a human rights specialist, but it seems to me that there's a perennial tension, if you like, between human rights ideals and principles and what some people call the political deployment of rights. And there are some difficult issues there. I mean, what I mean by human rights ideals and principles, I mean things like equality of all persons. I mean things like dignity. I mean things like requiring that all the basic conditions of a decent life are met. And those are things about which I think we can organize productively. And upon some occasions, the official discourses of human rights may be useful. But I think increasingly, as Dennis highlighted earlier, not just in relation to the USA and Russia at the present moment, but within, for example, or between the countries of Africa, we're seeing a rather difficult set of issues arising, which of course we saw in parts of Asia earlier on, where official forms of human rights discourse have very limited traction, no matter how loudly they are shouted at others, and no matter how often states are reminded of their obligations under the various agreements that they've signed. And so I think there's actually an argument, and I hope we can discuss this a little bit, about what we might call the vernacularization of human rights, or the turning, in a sense, of those basic principles into a language, a mode of address, a set of ideas which retain the authenticity of those principles, but which we can use politically in different circumstances. I often recall, for example, that in my own country, the UK, within our own borders, human rights principles have variable traction. They are often the principles that are used for other nations, and again, particularly, I've noticed that here in Australia as well. They are the principles, at least when formally stated, that others should adhere to, and the assumption somehow is that we are already fine. There are no real problems to be looked at. But again, if I think back to our Labour government under Tony Blair, the first administration, which did bring in, for example, things like civil partnerships, interestingly, the language that secured that goal, in my view anyway, was the language of it being the decent thing to do, the fair thing to do, the British thing to do. Which, I mean, of course, is in tension with a different set of Britishnesses, which we're probably seeing more of today. But on the other hand, nobody wants to be thought of being unfair or not decent or not doing the right thing, do they? Well, at least in my country at that moment in history. And remember that as well, because the traction that you get from different forms of rights discourse will vary from moment to moment in time. So those are just a few of my thoughts about that.
Malu, can I ask you, in speaking to this, to say a little bit also about your current involvement with the discussion about the post-MDG framework? Because, as I hope people know, the Millennium Development Goals, which in a sense were a global agenda for development, are ending next year. And they did specifically mention, I think they use AIDS rather than HIV, right?
AIDS,
yeah, so
yes.
they mention AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria, and there are specific goals around AIDS. There are no specific goals in the MDGs that relate to sexual or gender rights, but there has obviously been discussion about what may happen in a post-2015 global agenda. So Malou, maybe you could reflect on, because you've been just involved in meetings around that, in how far the human rights paradigm may help bring the issues we're concerned about today into that global development agenda.
Okay, that's actually what I was going to segue into.
Oh, sorry.
Well, it's just great. I actually, before you asked that question, I was thinking that, to in fact make it even more specific, to look at it from the frame of sexual rights, because that really is under threat. And that was very clear in the last meeting. If I don't know if you're all familiar with the process regarding the post-2015 development agenda, but what happened is that the UN General Assembly, they created this structure called the Open Working Group, which has had all the meetings to draft, what they call the outcome document, which will be the basis for the discussions on the next round of the Sustainable Development Goals, as they call it now. It's not MDG, but SDGs. And there are now 16 from what was 8 previously. And gender equality is actually a separate goal, as is the right to health. Oh, sorry, not the right to health, but there is a health goal, and under that there is a target on AIDS. So in fact, AIDS is not a specific goal anymore, unlike how it was in the MDGs, but it's now a target under the health goal. One of the red lines in that whole discussion, really, of the last session of the Open Working Group, which just concluded last week, was on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And it was the most contentious issue of all. In fact, the co-chairs had to create 2 caucuses to resolve it, because obviously there was no consensus. If you have countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and an observer like the Vatican, who would, really make very strong statements against any inclusion whatsoever of sexual and reproductive health and rights. The compromise ended up with SRH being included in the gender equality goal. It was also included in the health goal, plus reproductive rights. But sexual rights was definitely not there. So I think it's very clear that when we talk about sexual rights, it's going to be the last frontier when we're dealing with issues of human rights. And if this is where the intersection really is, with HIV, because then it's all about your right to bodily integrity, your right to your own autonomy, your right to information, and the right to make informed choices based on that information with regards to your sexual desires, with regards to your partnerships, with regards to what you do to your body. And so I think this is where, alliances can be really built around the same issues, that are we're facing when we talk about our own rights to our bodies. Abortion, for instance, the whole issue of abortion, sex work, HIV and LGBT. I think this is really where we coalesce together, because at the end of the day, this is going to be the last frontier. And if it's about our bodies being, a political issue, this is where a lot of the states get threatened. And I think we need to really make very clear strategies in the next round of, the next 15 years, because that is going to be a critical battle point.
Yeah. I share your same impression about the human rights framework impregnating the conference, and I have my own concern about that framework. And one has to do with human rights becoming a common rhetoric round, that basically everyone is talking about human rights. We talk about human rights, and the right wing talk about human rights. Just put your Freudian example that everyone is born bisexual. That can be used in order to advance human rights in the sense of protecting the right to express their sexual orientation, and as a matter of human rights, it can be used to force reparative therapy, because even, gay men were born bisexual, so maybe there is a chance of curing them. So in that sense, everyone is using human rights as a common language. On the other hand, the human rights system have its own hierarchies. So when we talk about human rights in general and then start talking, for example, about human rights and gender, it's usually not possible to introduce transgender issues in a gender agenda frame on human rights. And maybe it's going to sound a bit strange, but in order to be a subject of human rights, you need to be human first. In the case of intersex people, we are most of the time considered to be human once that our bodies have been mutilated. And even when intersex people have the most extreme burden of genital mutilation based on a traditional practice, like medicine, we occupied a very low, a place when it comes to be about genital mutilation. So in that sense, I think that we need to work more on the sexual and reproductive rights framework, but I also would like to see more work in bodily issues, and not necessarily taking the body as a given, because so far in the sexual rights framework, everything starts with sexual difference, and human rights violation happening in the way of producing sexual difference are usually non-spoken, beyond intersex activism.
Laura, can I pick up something? I'm actually going to pick up something everybody said, but when you said everyone uses the language of human rights, I would like to go back to my feeling. It actually also touches very much, Ottman, on what you said about we need to invest more in human rights. When we started putting this panel together, and those of you who've been involved in these conferences will know that putting a panel together for an IAS conference is actually harder than choosing a pope. But in the negotiations around this panel, I was very hopeful for a while that we would have one of Russia's leading, and I'm going to use a term which, interesting, no one's used, queer activists, someone who now lives in the United States because she actually felt her kids would be taken away from her were she to stay in Russia. I think the reality is that in many parts of the world, governments do not use the human rights language. And it really comes back, Ottman, to your comment, we need to invest more in human rights. How effectively does one invest in human rights in countries where governments will deliberately use language that most of us in this room would probably use, and that everyone on the panel is using, as a way of actually perpetuating their grip on power? And I think this, before we talk about investing in human rights, we have to actually know what that would mean. And let's go to your part of the world. What would it mean in Museveni's Uganda? What would it mean in Nigeria? What would it mean in Saudi Arabia? What would it mean in Iran?
Well, yes, I think I'm not pessimist to the extent that to say that in some contexts we cannot do anything. I think some countries are harder than others. I think there are different levels of work that can be done. There is work that can be done at community level to strengthen at least the communities. I think to advocate on the top, if the community is not strong, if the community is not protected, if the community is not empowered, it will never work. And I think one of the mistakes that we have been doing also is to try to change or to advocate on the top level or decision-making level while we don't have a strong community. And when I say investment in human rights, that's what I was saying, investing in communities and investing not on, I don't know if human rights is the good work, but investing in the well-being of people, in the well-being of communities. And I think this is how we strengthen communities, and this is. I think the result, we cannot take the result. In fact, the bad results that we are having now in the cases of Uganda or Saudi Arabia, etc., for me is the consequence of the work that has not been done for years. And this is why we arrived to that. So I think the most important thing for me is to invest in communities, in people, not in strategies or, we have these big slogans and these big campaigns, and then we are going to cost them, and then we budget them, and we say this is what needs to be done to end the epidemic. I think it's not going to work like this. But I'm more asking for investment in individuals, in humans, in their well-being. And in the well-being, there is human rights, but there are also other things.
Anyone want to pick up on Othman?
I think I would just...
Talking to the mic, Peter.
No, it wasn't switched on. It's switched on now. I think that I really agree with what Othman was saying. At the end of the day, we need multi-leveled approaches. We need to work, of course, with national governments, and we need to remind them of what they signed, and indeed not just what they signed, but what lies behind what they signed. But we also need to work at a middle level with NGOs and other umbrella groups and organizations, assuming, of course, that those organizations are themselves, A, informed, they're not always informed, B, democratic in the way they operate and willing to listen to a range of voices, and C, willing to represent people as opposed to represent their own leadership, which is unfortunately true that in many parts of the world, NGOs, just like other social organizations, can take on a life of their own and become a little disconnected from things. And then, of course, we need to work at the grassroots. I mean, but there I think the issue I raised earlier of vernacularization or of finding a language, finding a set of issues, a set of concerns that ordinary people, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, I mean ordinary people engage with and are affected by in their everyday lives is crucial. And the mistake we often make is to say we'll work at one of those levels. We will work only, for example, with the parliamentarians, and we've seen that little bit of this conference. There's a very important group to work with, but on the other hand, those other two levels require our attention as well.
Yes, and can I just make one comment about the working with politicians? What has struck me in the 12 years since we had a regional conference in Melbourne to this conference is that at this conference there are a large group of parliamentarians and they are talking to each other. When we did ICAP in Melbourne, I had this very rich, strong memory of the Nepali health minister sitting in the hall with all the local Nepalese delegates and saying to me afterwards, that is the first time I have talked to people who are positive. And I just wanted to really back up what Peter said. I do not think there is any value at all in flying in lots of high-level dignitaries and isolating them in the part of the building you can only get to with a conference pass. And I'm also going to ask Malou if you want to comment on this discussion, and then I'm going to move to a last question and then open it up to the floor.
Okay. The parliamentarians, you mean, or?
No.
Okay.
Where we started, which I've now forgotten.
Okay. Just talking about that whole issue on investing in rights and in the context of maybe repressive environments. And I think that's really why we create movements, because that's the base of the work that you have to do in order to address the whole issue of human rights. And if your government, your parliament is not responsive when it comes to enabling you to exercise your rights, and that's where you create movements, and at the same time that's where you establish relationships with other similar movements. I think for LGBT activism in our experience in the Philippines, we really worked also closely with the human rights groups. We worked closely with the women's movement, and so to build that cross-cutting alliance with like-minded organizations. At the same time, I think we need to also take into account the non-state actors, because this whole issue of rising fundamentalisms really need to be addressed, and we're talking of religious fundamentalism in particular. Again, going back to our context in the Philippines, where the Catholibans are really trying to impose their will onto the government, and we saw that very clearly when we were trying to pass the law on reproductive health. It took 12 years. And even, our battle to have the anti-discrimination bill is still languishing, and we filed that the earliest version of that bill came out in 1998, and it still hasn't progressed. So I think, there is a long way to go, and sometimes when we have successes, we need to be very conscious of protecting that success, because human rights is very fragile. At any given time, it can disappear. And so we need to be constantly vigilant about protecting, what we've gained. And so I think that's also where investing really in community mobilization is critical, because that's, the only way you can sustain the work that you have with regards to addressing human rights. The other thing is, of course, establishing relationships with human rights institutions. Like, I don't know, most countries in this region would have a National Commission on Human Rights, for example. It may be worth, in some countries we've seen some progress where they do start talking about SOGI issues. And when we say SOGI, it's SOGI with an E at the end. It's not just gender identity, but it also includes expression. And we have a long way to go, but I think, I guess we're just stubborn really as activists, and we don't want to, just put a break to it. The other thing I want to share, which is really an interesting discussion we had when there was the IAS conference last year in Malaysia, and there was a pre-conference on HIV in Islamic settings, and this guy from Iran was talking about how they managed to overturn this whole issue of addressing drug use in the country, because if it's looked at as an addiction, then it really sort of medicalizes it, and then you can rationalize a health response. But how do we deal with MSM, for instance, he was asking. And then he said, maybe the way to do it is to also treat this as an addiction. That, it is the compulsion to engage in unsafe behaviors that we need to treat. And of course, it created such an uproar in the discussion. But see, this is the kind of thinking that I think we need to really be critical about and be conscious, because then if we're not there when people are designing programs, when people are trying to craft the response, then we will have these kinds of ill-defined responses.
Yeah, sure.
Something very, very brief. I agree with the suggestion about the need of investing in the communities and to pay attention to what's happening at the local movement level, and not necessarily reflecting human rights at the international level or the regional level. I'm talking from a trans perspective. It also implies to be able for agencies, like funding agencies and international institutions, to invest in the community by recognizing the expertise of these communities. Because some communities, like mine, are supposed to provide the victims and supposed to provide testimonies, are supposed to provide a token participant in a workshop or a panel or a conference. And for people that wanted to invest in our communities, it never crossed their minds that maybe a way of investing is hiring trans people to do work on trans issues. And that's a very good way of investing in the community. Stop requiring people to provide their knowledge for free, and giving people the opportunity to have a career doing activism.
Okay, look, I think we should move to a period of questions, and I should warn you all, I have a reputation as a fascist chair, which is why I'm chairing, and a question is a sentence with a question mark at the end of it. It is not a time for people in the audience to stand up and tell us for 10 minutes your personal life story. There are many places to do that, and this is not one of them. So what I would like to do is, people want to ask questions. There are, the reason I was doing this is we literally, as Peter said, we can't see. There are mics on either side of the room. So if you want to make a comment, I'm serious, of course you can make a brief comment as well as a question, but keep it brief. Go to one of the mics. What I'll ask the four panellists to do is to just jot down points that occur to you. And after we've had a few comments and questions, I'll let each of you respond as you wish, but there's no obligation for everybody to respond to every question. And I am really conscious of the fact that time is limited, it's Friday, most of us are exhausted. So please all bear that in mind. I've been so successful as a fascist, no one's coming up. Now they are, okay.
A lot of them.
I can't hear, there are microphones. If you want to say something, go to a mic.
But we are going to guess, so...
Well, if we can't hear it, well, we can't guess.
Yeah.
So I'm Wu, and I'm from Youth Voices Count. We represent young transgender persons and young MSM in Asia and Pacific. Thank you for a wonderful panelist. I have a question regarding the advocacy of the issue of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression to a global body like the UN. Because from my observation so far, the more we are advocating for the issues to the UN, there seems to be a backfire effect from a more conservative member states, such as Russia, and other conservative allies who try to pass a document on family without the inclusion of LGBT people, and they try to protect the more traditional value of family. So I'm just wondering if as far as we try to advocate for these issues to the UN, should it be a good should it be a good choice to continue to do it? Because it seems like, yeah, they do not benefit
okay,
us.
You've asked the question. Yeah. Sorry, I am... No, I have to do this because otherwise very few people get to say anything. So I think we know the question. It's an important question and we will come to it, okay?
Hi, just quick comment, Mauro. I really appreciate your comment about economic justice. I think that's fundamental. My question, we know that many of us share experiences across borders, yet we experience our rights within a national context. And so I would really love to hear from the panel your sense of what's the role of international organizing versus what actually happens, what needs to happen within countries.
Hi, I'm from the Philippines, and I'm just happy to hear from Malu, one of the LGBT pioneers in the LGBT movement in the Philippines. My question is just coming from a developing country, how do we deal with in dealing with LGBT issues, wherein sometimes in working with other human rights organizations where our issues are not considered as a priority, given that we have to deal with land rights, indigenous rights, and all these other things, and we've always felt that we've always been sidetracked. So I just want to know how we can deal with that. Thank you.
Yeah, at the back. Can we take one question, then I'm going to see if anyone on the panel wants to respond, because the first two questions were in the same terrain. But yes, to the back, Mike.
So my question is, how can we imagine vernacularization of human rights in difficult cultural contexts for LGBTI issues?
Great. Thank you so much. Look, can we just, I don't know if anyone on the panel wants to respond to the first two questions, which essentially were really around how important and how do we deal with international bodies as distinct from national bodies. And Lou, you may want to comment on this because you've just been dealing with the international system.
I think you deal with both, really. I mean, there's no question about that. But I guess Laurel's issue is more about, the international organizing bit versus, the role of international organizing versus what happens locally. And for us, we always have that principle where the decision making is really local in terms of how you want to pursue a particular issue. For instance, there's a case of discrimination that's happening, and sometimes we have all these. I remember that era of emergency alerts that had to spread worldwide, and people really being in solidarity with what's happening on the ground, and sometimes it can have a backlash because then other countries really don't want other other countries interfering in internal affairs. So I think it needs to be measured as a campaign strategy. And it's really case to case. It's quite difficult to make a generalized comment on it. Just in terms of SOGI, I think, just wanted to actually flag that in September, the UN Human Rights Council is going to put forward a resolution on SOGI. And I think it's really critical for those of us here who if our countries are members of the UN Human Rights Council, to do that lobbying, because the UN is again going to table it for discussion. And yes, I think we can expect the stronger we push for it, the more that the resistance is going to happen. And we've seen that trend over the years. It's not recent. When you start pushing for an issue which is not very popular, I mean, the ones opposed to it will really intensify their efforts. And they're very organized, I have to say. In the post-2015 discussions, the Catholibans were very organized. So I think, we need to also step up our game and not let this take over us.
Yeah, I think that, yes.
Yeah, I think what happens at the UN and global level is exactly what happens at national level. And I think it's worth to do it at UN level, even if there is this risk of backlash. And in fact, in our countries, all this repression is new. If you go in the 50s and 60s and 70s, my older gay friends who were young at that time, Morocco was completely free. You can do whatever you want. There was no repression. There were no people arrested, etc. Even if these laws were never implemented, and these laws came with the colonization, etc., where discussion came, but people have always been free. There was religions that says you should do this or that, but not the laws. And even when the laws have been put in place, they have never been implemented. The repression comes when it becomes a political issue, when the communities start to get organized and start to speak out and ask for their rights of whatever. So anyway, it is going to happen. And I think it's worth, because it opens discussions, and it can be used by us, even if we are living in this hard or difficult context, to start discussions and to make people organized, to say, oh, there's something happening and we need to work around that. And it comes maybe just one word on the last question, which is a topic for a whole conference. But we need to keep in mind that in what we call difficult contexts, there's a problem of human rights in general, not only for MSM. For freedom of speech, there are journalists who are arrested, there are people who protest for, I don't know, about their work, who are beaten or who are arrested, etc. And I think the good strategies in these countries, like Saudi Arabia, like Iran, like even a lot of Muslim countries in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, is to create alliances between all these people who have this kind of problems. This doesn't mean, I don't want to say we should not address LGBTI issues as LGBTI issues and we put everything inside. We need to have this different movement, these different communities who are organized, who are supported. But when it comes to go together to confront our enemies, then we need to have all these issues together, and I think this is the best way to push it. But of course, if you go on in a country, people can tell you why you're asking, you want rights for gay, why even journalists, everybody thinks it's normal to arrest a journalist or to jail him or even to kill him or whatever, and you're coming and talking to me about gay rights. So I think we need, for these alliances to happen, we need to have strong groups, because if the LGBTI groups in these alliances are the weakest ones, they are, even with their allies, they are going to be destroyed. But I think the best way to do it, let's keep in mind that in these countries, people are fighting on different issues, and I think we need to take what unites people together against these values or these that are promoted by our enemies, and I think this is the best way to do it, unfortunately, in these countries.
Okay. Okay, yeah, and then I know that Alan and Sophia are in line to ask questions.
Okay. So I don't share your optimism about having a resolution on LGBT rights in September. No, not especially not after the voting count. For resolution on the protection of the family. But I also think that for those of us doing activism at the UN, it's really necessary to start considering how we build our agenda, why we are putting all the weight of our agenda, for example, in looking for a resolution on LGBT rights, instead of paying more attention to the UPR processes, to organizing submissions, you know, at the local level, to the special procedures. I'm part of an international initiative around the reform of the international classification of diseases that is going on at the World Health Organization. And we have an historic opportunity of removing pathologizing diagnoses affecting trans people from the chapter on mental health issues and putting them elsewhere. And this process is being threatened by the insistence of some countries in passing a resolution on LGBT health, which have a very poor and weak text. But anyway, we tend to think that in order to advance LGBTI rights, we need to have LGBTI written somewhere. Otherwise, it's not good work, even if we are talking about trans depathologization and depathologization of gender variance in childhood and getting rid of BDSM as a diagnostic category. In terms of the question about the voices at the local, the relation between the international level and the local level. I come from a country that has the best gender identity law in the world, and it was a law drafted and negotiated and at the parliamentary level by people who are basically trans sex workers that didn't have access to high school education. So basically they don't speak English, and they are usually not invited to this kind of conferences or panels. And one of the main concerns of the trans movement is how to move all the expertise that we have in our countries to the international level, where only few people that have access to English as a tool on communication have the opportunity of building an international agenda that's still dominated from people from the global north.
Okay, I'm going to ask the panel now to take notes, because you don't get to say anything until we get towards the end, to allow because we're already getting a few people coming to mic. So Alan, Sophia and Adichie, my God, I know all of you. Alan.
Okay, look, I just want to raise an issue that is less about an intersection between LGBTI rights and HIV, but rather a yawning chasm between them. And that is probably the Sero divide. And I think we all agree, and we've all heard at this conference, that we won't achieve effective responses to HIV, particularly in concentrated epidemics, until we recognise LGBTI human rights, and no one disagrees with that. I think also conversely, in many countries, HIV has actually created the space for LGBT people to organise, or particularly G and increasingly T, to organise around HIV and actually to develop some institutions and infrastructure. I'm just going to use two quick examples at the national level to show...
Alan, I'm sorry, but I did say a question.
I know you did. I said,
and I'm going to stop you giving two examples.
It is going to be, Dennis, it'll be a question, but the examples, I think, illustrate the question very quickly. So, very briefly, some alliance work in Peru that we tried to do, bringing together key populations. They were people with HIV, sex workers and gay men. The biggest challenge in establishing this project was that the people with HIV felt uncomfortable associating with sex workers and gay men. The interesting thing is that 95% of people with HIV in Peru acquired it through sex work and sex with men. And so I'll use one example, Dennis, so to make you feel calmer. So what I'll point to there is a huge divide that still exists between HIV positive and HIV negative people that I think creates an enormous challenge for moving forward with bringing the rights together collectively. And I wonder if members of the panel could comment on that.
It's not my calmness, it's allowing everybody an equal opportunity to ask questions. Sophia?
All right, thank you. I really appreciated the thoughtfulness of the panel so far. And one of the issues that I've had in this conference is that there's, in this move towards biomedical solutions, the ways in which that move is being justified and framed using human rights language without harnessing the power of the language and it actually undermining what the power of that language can do in reality. And I am really struck with and appreciate very much the attempt, Dennis, in your questions and in everybody's responses, to try to untangle who we are as people and to not be using the acronym salad as the way to talk about things. And so I guess my question to the panel is, if we think about the power of human rights and what that means to each of you, which is maybe perhaps quite different, and think about the individual populations that we talk about in that word salad. When we think about lesbians, when we think about gay men, when we think about trans populations, when we think about bisexuals, when we think about intersex populations, and I'm deliberately saying them individually so that they're not part of the salad, how is it that in the context of each of these can we actually think about using rights more effectively in HIV programming? And I specifically mean in the context of HIV. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jeffrey Acaba from the Philippines, and I do recognize that HIV has actually provided a space for LGBT to push for the rights of LGBTs. My question is on alliances. How can I actually reconcile internal community stigma? Because as early as 2012, there have been studies already, and we see in these different movements that within gay movements, for instance, there are young gay men who actually disowns young gay men who are living with HIV. So how can I actually reconcile these alliances and form a stronger movement?
We talked about human rights, we talked about reframing the language, we talked about alliance building as well, and in activism within the United Nations. And I just want to ask if these are actually the game changers that we need in order to push for SOGI and human rights. And if not, what would be our game changers?
Okay, thank you all very much. Oh, no, there is another question, sorry.
Just one more, and that is, speaking about alliances, we've heard quite obviously that many of the negative voices around human rights are coming from the faith community. Where are the alliances being built with positive voices within the faith community to take this agenda forward?
Okay, I'm going to exercise great restraint and not make a comment on the concept of a faith community, but I am going to ask everyone on the panel to think about the series of questions, and if I can just try and pull them together, and then I'll ask you to just take some time reflecting both on the questions we've heard and on the general content of the panel. I mean, I think we've got a lovely way of framing it, which is the question about what are the game changers. And I think if we think about that then, and how that relates to the other points that have been raised, the zero, what Alan called the zero divide, the alliances between a movement around sexuality and gender identity and a movement of people living with HIV, and more broadly, what other sorts of alliances are possible and where people whose primary concern is sexual rights and gender identity might fit into that broader alliance. And I think I will just, Peter, go to you and then let everybody on the panel both think about those questions but also make any final reflective comments you want to make.
The question of game changers, I think, is a really crucial one, because my feeling throughout this conference has been that we are being invited to participate in a series of fantasies which are not of our own making. And so therefore I think the game does need to be changed quite dramatically. And in relation to human rights, I think it needs to be changed by some efforts to clarify the appropriate and the inappropriate use of the concept. Indeed, I think if there's a funder present, perhaps we could have a small guide, no more than 8 pages, please, to appropriate and inappropriate uses, written in everyday language, by the way, so we can all understand it. Because I think that at the moment, certain forms of human rights discourse are being used in order to justify virtually anything. And this is not what we struggled for, this is not what we wanted to get. But it ties to my second point, which is just a closing observation, I guess, about vernacularization. The question was asked earlier on, how can we get vernacularization in contexts that are really difficult? In other words, how do we make rights discourses and the essence of rights appealing to people? Well, ultimately, of course, I don't think I can answer that except for the context I know best, which was the UK, and I gave an example from that, because at the end of the day, we need people who are indigenous, people who are local to the culture, people who've struggled within it, to be able to identify the kinds of terminology, the kinds of language, the kinds of issues which have that sort of an appeal. But I do think it's a worthwhile task, but having said that, I know that there are also those in the human rights movements internationally who object really strongly to the notion of vernacularization for a variety of reasons. So we may need to have some discussions about that first of all, but those for me would be game changers.
I really appreciate the question on the biomedicalization of the language of rights. For me, it has been really, I wouldn't say it's surprising, it has been really shocking how in this conference there have been very sophisticated conversations about biotechnological approaches to the health of populations that are struggling to survive violence, starvation, not access to very basic rights. So it seems that we are doing great at the biomedical level, and I'm afraid that very old work like injustice or oppression or violence are not adequate for the framework that we are using. And as someone that comes from a different framework, I feel really strange when all the time I have to talk about my own communities as TG people, in the way in which we stop being people or persons and become populations or pops. So, and then you can have an entire sentence, a paragraph, or a panel, or an entire conference using these words that have really a very weird meaning when translated to our everyday life. On the other hand, and maybe this is paradoxical, I would really like to have the language on K-pops to be taken seriously and to see more TGs representing, for example, as keynote speakers, because it's really hard when you need to adapt, your tongue to pronunciate all that kind of acronyms and things, an English combination of words. And then they are meaningless when it comes to be about real political participation. So my feeling is that we are talking about very old processes with new words, and the new words are basically not changing anything, just making us feel more engaged in biotechnological change. So when we talk about what's going to change this game, I don't know. I think that there are several games going on at the same time. In the case of, and I'm sorry I anticipate my apology for the joke. In terms of the contacting progressive faith communities, I will be careful about contacting the Pope. I mean, he looks progressive, but believe me, he's not that progressive as he appears to be. So if someone is thinking about sending him a letter or inviting him to the next conference, I will try to think it twice.
Well, I think there's one important point that I would like to highlight as well is this threat of biomedicalization of the HIV response. And I think we're go back to our own country with a new slogan, which is the 90-90-90 targets. So HIV is just a disease that should be detected. We give people pills and then they are undetectable and it's done, AIDS disappeared. So I think this is a very tricky thing. I think the governments are going to love it because it's so simple. And the funders are going to love it because it's more cost effective than investing in human rights. And I'm a bit disappointed that at this stage, especially this stage, where we know that all what needs to be done to stop the epidemic, we know it. The problem is now how to get people receiving it or getting it. And the main barrier is criminalization, is all these human rights issues. And I think we need to be very careful before going to our countries or putting this in our posters or our organizations or activities. When it comes to the synergies, I think that about this question of internal stigma within the communities between either LGBT activists or HIV activists, the positives and the negatives, I think for a while, one of the mistakes we did is that we asked people to do something which was not their jobs. And I think one of the reasons why we failed having LGBTI movements, many of them are doing less and less work on HIV because they don't want to reduce the issue only to one disease. And I think their arguments are right, is because we ask them to do a work that they are not supposed to do. And similarly, we asked some HIV groups who were working on the HIV strict agenda to do maybe a rights group that they were not prepared or ready to do. And there are groups who are doing both and they are doing it very good. So I think what I'm saying about investment, I think we need to invest on everything, on all these groups, the different groups. And I'm sure the alliance are going to be created if we're not asking people to change things, if we're not creating competition between these two or three movements. Last word maybe about positive voices among the religious leaders, and I think the weight of the religion in my region is very, very strong, and it's a big part of the problem. I personally don't believe that if we didn't succeed in 35 years just to convince a statement on a condom, while all the reluctant governments like Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc., are okay with the condom. And if we don't have, a religion officially, I'm not saying about individual voices can do things in a community, can help, but from the compassion side and I'm not really comfortable with it. I'm not doing charity work, I'm doing activism. I don't believe that the oppressors should be the first allies. I think it's the last ones that I will ally with because for the moment they are my oppressors.
I'm not going to say much about the faith-based work because I've struggled with it for so long, especially in the Philippines. It's really a very marked challenge for us, and we've not had success, I think, for the most part, when we talk about changing perspectives and changing mindsets of a very fixed, ideology that's in place, and so. Yeah, I would rather invest my time and my energy elsewhere where it's, my success or the success of the work would be more measurable. Given that, just going back to the question of Jonas about game changers, I think we work on many fronts, and at any front where we achieve success, that would be a game changer, whether it's local, whether it's national, whether it's global. So I know that in the work of many countries in the region, really addressing for instance, the issue of discrimination at the local level. Having AIDS ordinances, having anti-discrimination ordinances at the local level can be a game changer. It may not be really big and broad, but it can significantly affect the lives of many people. Similarly, when we have national laws change, when we have policies reversed, that would also be a game changer. But as Othman mentioned earlier, it really is taking so long for this to change when in fact we've seen, through how many? 3 decades of the epidemic that really criminalization, all the legal and policy barriers are the main obstacles that impede our road to success when we talk about the HIV response. So we have to keep going back to that, and we have to keep banging our governments to address that. That really is a wretched role I think we play in this whole response. The other thing is, this whole issue of the biomedical approach, which as activists, I think we need to constantly interrogate, because at the end of the day, it's not really changing inequalities. It's not changing power structures. It's not changing hierarchies. And of course, you give a pill, you give a condom, etc., but does it change power dynamics? And so we need to keep going back to that. Also, when we talk about what is the landscape now that we're dealing with, I think we forgot the whole frame of social media, because a lot of things are really going on in social media. And just for me, reflecting as someone who's been there quite a while back when there was no internet, when there was no no easy access to information, it's a very different terrain that we're operating on now. And I think in some ways it's also good and bad, because it has impacted on the kind of activism that we've done. Now people can just live autonomous lives, be anonymous, and live their own gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender lives. And before, we had the need to get together. We needed that compulsion to have meetings face to face, etc. Now you just communicate virtually, and that's it. So I think it has, in some sense, impacted on the kind of solidarity and movement building work for us. The other thing I also want to share is that when we talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights, and I keep going back to that, it's going to be a trade issue, because when we talk about governments negotiating agreements and negotiating the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda, they will easily trade SRHR, and we've seen that in fact in the discussions in New York, and that's going to keep happening. So I think that really is the red line and the red flag for us when we talk about the whole issue of what are our bare minimums when we talk about the advocacy and activism, and we have to really keep pushing. And for me, at the end of the day, it's all about humanizing the response. It's all about demystifying this concept of identities, because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and we should all go back to that.
Okay, I want to make two points in conclusion. These conferences like to claim that they bring together analysis and activism. I think today was an extraordinary example where we succeeded in doing that. I wish it had happened more often, but I think today we did it, and I'm thrilled. I also want to say I am genuinely privileged. This is part of an ongoing discussion. I feel very lucky to be on a platform with people I've worked with in different situations over a very long period. Mauro and I have not, but I think we will in future. And if I had another 2 hours, and I promise you I don't, I could recount the sort of various intersections. But I do want to just mention that this conversation picked up on many of the issues that were raised in the MSM Global Forum last weekend, and it's lovely to have that continuity flow through the conference. So thank you all very much. Thank you to the audience. Enjoy.